The air in Precinct 8 was a stale mix of old coffee and burnt-out ambition. Detective Marcus Mac Caldwell hunched over a file, the fluorescent lights humming a sickly lullaby above his head. Mac was a man built for raincoats and shadows, a veteran whose eyes held the weary wisdom of too many midnight calls. He was known for his icy calm, a trait that was about to be severely tested. It was 2:17 a.m. The city slept a shallow, uneasy sleep. The call came in not as a priority 1, a murder, but as a 6 alpha, a noise complaint, unusual circumstances. The dispatcher's voice, usually a monotone drone, had a slight tremor. Detective Caldwell, we have a situation at the old Pendleton Estate. Caller reported, screaming, sir. But not just screaming. They claimed the sounds were coming from under the house. And the caller was Officer Reid. She sounded terrified. Mac raised an eyebrow, the first flicker of genuine interest he'd felt all night. The Pendleton Estate was a derelict mansion on the edge of the wetlands, vacant for 20 years after a gruesome, unsolved family disappearance. Reid was alone? Mac asked, grabbing his worn leather jacket. Affirmative. She was on routine patrol, investigating a suspected squatting. She's not responding now, detective. The drive was short but heavy. The Pendleton Estate loomed like a rotting tooth against the bruised, moonless sky. As Mac pulled up, the only light came from the swirling blue and red pulse of Officer Reid's abandoned cruiser. The driver's side door was ajar, the interior light casting a lonely glow on the empty seat. Mac stepped out. The silence wasn't quiet, it was a vast, suffocating void. The only sound was the damp squelch of his boots on the overgrown lawn and the distant, rhythmic croaking of frogs, a sound that somehow felt aggressive, mocking that he approached the patrol car. Officer Reid's radio mic lay on the seat, but her service weapon was still holstered. She hadn't been ambushed in a fight, she had simply vanished. Mac's flashlight beam cut through the darkness toward the house's foundation. The estate was built on stone stilts to guard against the marsh, leaving a crawlspace that was normally sealed off, but now, a section of the rusted lattice skirting had been violently ripped open. The metal was bent outward, not inward, as if something immense had pushed its way out of the darkness beneath. Mac dropped to his knees, aiming the flashlight into the blackness of the crawlspace. The air that rushed out hit him like a physical presence, cold, metallic, and carrying a sharp, almost electrical odor. He had smelled death plenty of times, but this was different. This smelled like cold, wet iron and ancient earth. His beam danced across the mud and refuse, illuminating something pale. It was Officer Reid's police-issue flashlight, lying on the ground, still on, pointing up, and then Mac saw it. Not a body, not blood, but a trail. A line of disturbed earth that led away from the house and into the dense, foggy wetlands. It wasn't a footprint trail, it was a drag mark. Wide, deep, and perfectly straight, as if something heavy had been pulled, not carried. Mac swallowed, his practiced calm fraying at the edges. He looked back at the gaping hole in the foundation. Whatever had taken Officer Reid had come from below, and it hadn't tried to hide its passage. He spoke into his own radio, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. This is Caldwell. Officer down. Repeat, Officer Reid is missing. I'm initiating a solo pursuit into the marsh. Send every available unit, and call the state police for K-9 support. Tell them to focus on the south swamp line. He turned off the flashlight and holstered his radio. The frogs' croaking intensified, and in the deep shadows of the estate, Mac heard a new sound, faint but unmistakable. It was a slow, wet, deliberate scraping noise. It wasn't coming from the swamp. It was coming from the walls of the Pendleton Estate, from the deep, undisturbed darkness of the second story. It sounded like a massive, serrated claw dragging itself across dry plaster, waiting. Mac knew then that this wasn't just a missing person case. This was an invitation. Detective Mac Caldwell froze, his back pressed against the cold, damp masonry of the estate's exterior. The scraping sound from the second floor had stopped the moment his radio clicked off. The silence that followed was suffocating, punctuated only by the frantic drumming of his own heart. He looked back at the gaping crawlspace. He had two choices: follow the drag mark into the perilous marsh where Officer Reid had been taken, or confront the unsettling noise emanating from the house. A gut feeling, the kind that had kept him alive through decades of patrolling the city's darkest corners, pulled him towards the latter. Whatever had emerged from below had done so with brute force. Whatever was inside felt intelligent, patient. Mac drew his sidearm, the familiar weight a small comfort against the sprawling, invisible threat. The front door was locked, but the wood surrounding the frame was splintered, suggesting a hasty, violent entry, likely by Officer Reid. He pushed the door inward. The interior of the Pendleton Estate was a mausoleum of dust sheets and decaying velvet. The air was colder inside, drier, and laced with that same coppery, electrical scent he had noticed outside. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom of the grand foyer, dancing over a spiral staircase draped in cobwebs. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing to explain Officer Reid's fear or disappearance, but there was the smell. It was stronger here, almost stinging the back of his throat. He followed it, moving cautiously toward the kitchen area. The kitchen was strangely clean, the only room without a heavy layer of dust. A stainless steel refrigerator, clearly modern and out of place, hummed quietly in the corner, contrasting sharply with the century-old fixtures. On the counter, nestled between two antique spice jars, was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine. It was an abstract shape, vaguely humanoid, but twisted, its limbs elongated and thin. It wasn't menacing, just intensely wrong. Mac picked it up, the wood cold and smooth under his glove. As he did, he heard the scraping sound again. This time, it wasn't a drag. It was a rhythmic, almost mechanical tapping, coming from directly above him, the floorboards of the second story. Tap, 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 tap. It sounded like a distorted code. Mac pocketed the figurine and moved quickly to the staircase. He took the steps slowly, his weight causing the old wood to groan under protest. He reached the landing and entered the long, dark hallway. The tapping had ceased. He checked the first few rooms, empty bedrooms, stripped of furniture, filled only with echoes. In the third room, the air shifted. It was warmer here, unnaturally so, and the metallic odor was overwhelming. He swung his light into the room. It was an attic space, low-ceilinged and cluttered with forgotten boxes. In the center of the room, on the dusty floorboards, was the source of the heat and the odor. A pool of dark, viscous liquid. It wasn't blood, it was too thick, almost tar-like, and it shimmered faintly under the flashlight beam, and floating in the center of the pool was Officer Reid's other missing item, her service phone. It was completely intact. As Mac stepped closer, the phone suddenly rang. It was a loud, jarring noise in the dead silence of the house. He instinctively recoiled, drawing back the hand he'd extended. He stared at the phone, vibrating in the oily liquid. It rang twice more, then went silent. Then, a moment later, the screen lit up with a single, new message. Mac gripped his pistol, leaning down just enough to read the bright text illuminating the black liquid. "You came for her. Good. Now we can talk about the hole." Mac's breath hitched. He wasn't dealing with a killer or a squatter. He was being lured by something that could tap codes and text messages from a dead phone. Before he could process the message, the floorboards beneath his feet creaked violently. The sound wasn't the natural settling of the house, it was the sound of something heavy shifting. He looked up, aiming his flashlight toward the source of the noise. It wasn't above him. It was under him. Mac realized the pool of black fluid wasn't on the floor. It was coming through the floor, slowly dissolving the wood. He was standing on a weak ceiling that was about to give way, dropping him directly into the hidden space below the attic. The floorboards splintered with a sound like tearing fabric. Mac lunged backward just as a section of the attic floor, directly beneath where the phone lay, collapsed into a gaping, jagged hole. The oily, black liquid poured down into the darkness below, hissing faintly as it cascaded over unseen objects. Mac shone his light into the newly formed void. It was not a drop into the ground floor. This was a hidden level, a crawlspace built between the attic and the second-floor ceilings. The air rising from it was intensely hot and thick with that metallic, coppery scent. He flattened himself on the remaining solid floor and aimed his beam into the small, dusty room beneath. It was a space that should not have existed, a windowless, rectangular chamber, and it was filled with machinery. A large, metallic apparatus dominated the hidden room. It wasn't modern, but looked like a strange, perverse blend of a 19th-century printing press and a primitive surgical table. Wires thicker than Mac's wrist snaked from a wall outlet, the source of the inexplicable electricity, and plugged into the central device, resting on a raised platform, covered in the same black, viscous fluid, was a large, spherical cage of rusted iron. And inside that cage, something was moving. Mac's blood ran cold. He had expected a hidden room, maybe a cultist's lair, but not this. This looked like a physics experiment gone monstrously wrong. As he watched, a section of the machinery, a piston attached to the iron sphere, retracted with a painful hiss of hydraulic fluid. The sphere rotated slightly, and the scraping sound, the one he had heard earlier, returned. It wasn't a claw. It was the sound of the iron cage grinding against the platform. Inside the sphere, Mac finally made out the shifting shape. It wasn't a person. It was a mass of white, fibrous material, like bundled tendons and sinew, constantly contracting and expanding. Then, from the center of the pulsating mass, a noise emerged. A choked, wet, unmistakable human voice. "Hole, the hole, help me," it was Officer Reid. Or what was left of her voice. Mac's training screamed at him, "Go down. Save the victim." But a lifetime of horror had taught him caution. He knew that the voice, trapped and mangled, was the ultimate bait. He scanned the room quickly. Near the machinery, there was a small, dusty table. On it were several items, a tattered, hand-bound journal with leather covers, and several more of the same crudely carved wooden figurines he had found downstairs, lined up in a neat, unsettling row. Mac grabbed his grappling hook and rope from his pack, quickly securing it to a sturdy beam near the hole. He lowered himself carefully into the chamber, landing silently on the dust-covered floor next to the mysterious machine. The air here was deafeningly loud. Not from sound, but from the low, resonant vibration humming through the floor, a vibration that felt deep, ancient, and alive. He moved to the journal first. As he flipped the cover, a faded inscription in elegant, looping script revealed the author, Dr. Silas Pendleton, the head of the family that vanished 2 decades prior. The first entry Mac skimmed made his gorge rise, June 14, 1998. The mechanism is complete. It does not pull on matter, not exactly. It pulls on the space between things. On the void. On the dimensional holes we stand on, unaware. And something always answers the call of the void. Something that is neither living nor dead, but simply, here. Mac looked from the insane passage to the iron sphere where Reid's mangled voice was crying out. Reid hadn't been killed and hidden, she had been integrated into this bizarre machine. Suddenly, the floor beneath Mac vibrated violently. A series of metallic clanks echoed around the room as the iron sphere holding Reid began to spin slowly. The trapped voice shrieked one last word, "Run." Then, the lights in the hidden room, supplied by the humming wires, died abruptly, plunging Mac into absolute, suffocating darkness. The only light was the weak beam of his handheld flashlight. Mac aimed the light at the machinery. The apparatus was still spinning, but the white mass inside the cage was no longer screaming. It was growing, from the top of the spinning sphere, something long, wet, and segmented, like an insect's antenna, but thicker, tipped with a pulsing red light, began to slowly, deliberately extend toward Mac's face. The segmented appendage, tipped with a sickly red luminescence, was mere inches from Mac's face when his survival instincts took over. He didn't think, he reacted, dropping to a crouch. Mac pivoted and fired a single, controlled shot from his pistol. The round struck the antenna-like limb near its base, not with the expected spray of blood, but with a horrifying sound, a wet thwack followed by a high-pitched, crystalline shatter. The limb instantly recoiled, snapping back into the spinning iron sphere with unnatural speed. The violent motion jarred the ancient machinery. The rhythmic vibration intensified, and the coppery scent of the room spiked, making Mac's eyes water. The spinning cage didn't stop, but the amorphous white mass inside seemed to convulse, then went eerily still. Mac had less than 5 seconds. He lunged across the small chamber, flashlight beam bouncing wildly, and swept the objects from the dusty table. He jammed the thick, leather-bound journal of Dr. Silas Pendleton into his jacket pocket and grabbed a handful of the unsettling wooden figurines, shoving them into his tactical vest. He scrambled for his rope. As he pulled himself through the jagged hole in the ceiling, the main wire feeding the machinery, the thick one plugged into the wall, suddenly snapped. the resulting electrical arc was blindingly white, momentarily illuminating the horror of the machine. Mac saw, in that split second, that the white mass within the cage had shifted, and where Officer Reid's mouth should have been, there was now only a single, dark cavity, perfectly round. Staring back, Mac hauled himself onto the attic floor. Below him, the exposed machinery began to smoke, and the air pressure in the room dropped so sharply it popped his eardrums that he didn't wait. He sprinted out of the attic, down the long hallway, the floorboards now echoing with a chorus of creaks and ominous groans. The whole house was settling, but not normally. It felt like it was folding in on itself. As he reached the main staircase, a colossal, rhythmic thump reverberated from the ground floor, right beneath the foyer. It was a sound too heavy to be human, too slow to be a collapse. It sounded like a giant, buried heart beginning to beat. Mac burst through the damaged front door and stumbled onto the lawn. The night was now a cacophony of sirens, flashing lights, and shouted commands. Precinct 8 had arrived. Sergeant Davis, a burly man whose face was usually an unreadable mask, rushed toward Mac, his expression a mix of relief and profound confusion. "Mac! What the hell happened? We heard the shot. Where is Reid?" Davis demanded, gesturing toward the house with his rifle. Mac leaned on the patrol car, gasping for breath, the stench of copper clinging to his clothes. He pulled the thick Pendleton journal from his pocket. "Reid is complicated, Sarge. She's in the house, but not in a way you can cuff and book," Mac said, his voice raw. "She was used to open a door. A dimensional door, according to this lunatic's journal." Davis stared, baffled. "Dimensional? Mac, the K9 units, they won't go near the marsh. They stopped dead at the mudline and started whining, facing the house. They're terrified of the Foundation." "They should be," Mac muttered, looking back at the dark, skeletal silhouette of the Pendleton Estate. "That's where the text said the hole is." Mac felt a sudden, burning heat against his chest. He reached into his vest and pulled out one of the wooden figurines he had grabbed. It was radiating warmth, vibrating faintly in his gloved hand. The abstract, twisted shape seemed to pulse in the flashing police lights. "We need to seal that house off, now. No entry. I need a forensics team, not SWAT, and I need a geologist. Someone who understands deep earth vibrations," Mac ordered, his gaze distant. "A geologist, Mac? We have an officer missing and this thing that attacked you." "Trust me, Sarge," Mac said, holding up the strange, warm wooden carving. "This isn't a murder case. It's a core sample. And whatever we've dug up is starting to look for its other pieces." As he spoke, a new, distinct vibration began to resonate not from the house, but from the asphalt beneath their feet. It started as a low tremor, then rapidly increased to a rhythmic thump, 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 that mirrored the sound Mac had heard moments earlier inside the foyer. It wasn't coming from the estate anymore. It was coming from the ground beneath Precinct 8's jurisdiction, a vast, unseen network being activated by the same monstrous mechanism. The horror had followed him home. "Get everyone out of the swamp and off this street," Mac commanded, his eyes wide. "We just woke something up." The rhythmic thump, 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 under the asphalt grew louder, transforming the ground into a giant, throbbing drum. Sergeant Davis, seeing the genuine terror in Mac's eyes, a look he hadn't seen since a bank siege 10 years prior, didn't hesitate. "Clear the perimeter. Emergency vehicles only. Move, move, move." Davis bellowed into his radio. The scene, moments ago a controlled police operation, dissolved into frantic movement. Mac ignored the chaos. He walked directly to the abandoned patrol car, his geologist and forensics requests already logged as urgent. He needed silence to read. He opened Dr. Pendleton's journal, his flashlight beam illuminating the maniacal script. The wooden figurine he'd pocketed was still vibrating, pulsing faster with the escalating ground tremors. It felt less like a sample and more like a key that he flipped past, pages filled with astronomical charts and esoteric diagrams until he found an entry marked, "Stabilizing the aperture. July 5, 1999. The initial trials were catastrophic. Subject Delta dissolved entirely. the dimensional shear requires an anchor, a static point to prevent the raw void from consuming the test area. The answer is organic geometry, a resonance counter. I have carved 13 such counters, embedding the principle of static, twisted form into their wood. As long as one is near, the mechanism will not expand beyond its local perimeter. But if they are all brought together, the perimeter becomes the core. Mac's breath caught. 13. He had only grabbed 5 in his haste. He looked at the single, vibrating figurine in his hand. If the others were still back in the hidden room, the machine was currently stabilized. But if those objects were scattered, the ground under the cruiser suddenly heaved. The car's suspension shrieked, and Mac was thrown against the door. He saw a fissure, a clean, surgical line, crack across the asphalt 20 feet away. Caldwell. We gotta pull back. Davis screamed over the sirens. I'm pulling back to the precinct. Mac shouted, clutching the journal and the figurine. We need to identify this vibration. I think the house is just a lure. The real mechanism is somewhere deep. Mac sped away from the Pendleton Estate, the red and blue lights fading in his rearview mirror. The rhythmic thumping followed him, a baseline to the city's fear. He reached Precinct 8 just as dawn was breaking, casting a sickly, gray light over the city. The tremor was less severe here, but still palpable, the coffee machines rattling, the lockers faintly shaking. Mac headed straight for the precinct archive, a subterranean vault of closed cases. He needed to find the original file on the Pendleton disappearances and verify Pendleton's claim that the estate was built over a natural hole in the spatial fabric. The archive was cold and silent, the air heavy with the scent of aged paper and institutional decay. Mac found the heavy, unmarked cardboard box for the Pendleton Family Incident, 1999. He dumped the contents onto a metal table. Old Polaroid photos, faded police sketches, and a stack of psychiatric evaluations for the missing Dr. Silas Pendleton. One item immediately caught his eye, a large, hand-drawn map. It was a geological survey of the entire city sector, dating back to the 1950s. The map wasn't about fault lines or water tables. It was overlaid with strange, radiating symbols, like occult sigils, all centered on one point, the Pendleton Estate, but the map also showed 4 radiating lines, traveling outward from the estate, connecting the central sigil to 4 other points scattered across the city. Mac traced the lines with a shaking finger. The 4 other locations were marked with faint, almost illegible script. He managed to decipher 3, the Old Iron Works, 1960, a factory shut down due to a mysterious, structural collapse. The City Reservoir, 1975, site of a mass drowning ruled accidental. The Central Library sublevel, 1988, site of an electrical fire that gutted the rare book archives. He looked at the 4th point. It was marked only with a faded symbol and the initials, P8.P8. Precinct 8. The precinct he was currently standing in. Mac looked up from the map. The rhythmic vibration suddenly intensified. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, then shut off completely, plunging the archive into darkness. He aimed his flashlight at the ceiling. Above the ceiling tiles, he could hear a sound, not the tapping from the mansion, but a faint, mechanical grinding, like gears turning in deep water. The tremor ceased instantly. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Mac realized the truth of the map. Pendleton didn't build the mechanism in his house. He built a network. And one of the anchor points, one of the 4 essential pillars connected to the dimensional hole, was directly beneath the foundation of Precinct 8. He looked at the wooden figurine in his hand. It was now glowing faintly, its twisted form pulsing with a life of its own. From the filing cabinet immediately to his left, Mac heard a distinct, heavy scrape, the sound of an empty drawer slowly being pulled open by an unseen hand. The sound of the filing cabinet drawer scraping open in the sudden darkness of the archive was a sound born of pure, distilled impossibility. Mac swung his flashlight toward the sound. The 3rd drawer from the bottom, which moments ago had been securely closed, was now slowly gliding outward. It stopped halfway, revealing not the usual neatly stacked manila folders, but a collection of objects, a chaotic, unsettling pile of antique medical tools, rusted keys, and another one of the wooden figurines. It was one of the missing resonance counters. Mac's heart hammered against his ribs. He had sealed the archive door himself upon entering. Whatever was operating the drawer was either physically present and unseen, or moving things remotely through some unnatural means. The latter was more terrifying that he approached the drawer cautiously, his pistol steady. The figurine resting among the debris was glowing faintly, synchronized with the one in his own hand that he reached out, snatching the second counter. As his fingers closed around the cold, carved wood, a voice, thin, echoing, and sounding like it was trapped inside a glass jar, whispered directly into his ear. "The missing pieces were never lost, Detective." Mac spun around, flashlight beam sweeping the empty, dusty room. The voice had come from nowhere and everywhere, a non-localized sound that rattled the bones. The filing cabinet drawer slammed shut with concussive force, sending a gust of cold air through the room. Mac quickly returned to the map, placing the two glowing wooden counters onto the drawn line connecting the Pendleton Estate to Precinct 8, P8. The counters immediately brightened, emitting a low, audible hum. "The key, the counter, it stabilizes the connection," Mac muttered, piecing together Pendleton's insane logic. "But the connection is already active." He flipped to the last pages of Pendleton's journal. The script had devolved into wild scribbles and frantic diagrams. The final legible entry was terrifying: September 1st, 1999. "It is hungry now. It is pulling the edges of its world into ours through the 4 anchor points. I can no longer contain it in the estate. The counters are the only defense, but they must be placed in a specific sequence, a geometrical defense, a pentagram of stillness against the dimensional flow. Without the sequence, the 4 sites will become 4 doorways." Mac looked at the 4 points on the map: the estate, the iron works, the reservoir, the library, and his own Precinct 8. Pendleton had located 5 key points, but his drawing only showed 4 connecting lines. That he was missing a piece of the geometry that he urgently needed to know what was physically buried beneath the precinct. Mac grabbed a crowbar from the archive's utility closet and headed for the main floor. The rhythmic thumping from beneath the building was back, louder, shaking the concrete structure that he found an inconspicuous hatch marked HVAC sublevel near the bullpen. He pried it open and dropped down into the dust-choked maintenance tunnels. The vibration here was deafening. The air was hot and thick, saturated with the coppery, metallic smell. Mac tracked the vibration to a massive, reinforced concrete chamber directly beneath the central evidence room. He approached the thick steel door. It was bolted shut with 3 industrial-grade locks. He shined his light through a small, grimy observation window. The chamber was enormous and empty, save for one object at its center, a large, oddly shaped piece of machinery that had been entirely encased in concrete. It was a massive, non-Euclidean shape, like a jagged piece of dark glass protruding from the foundation. As Mac watched, the vibrating stopped. A flash of movement within the chamber caught his eye. A shape, tall, impossibly thin, and glistening wet, peeled itself away from the far concrete wall. It moved with a sickening, disjointed gait. It was wearing a police uniform. It was the mangled, animated form of Officer Reid. Her head was tilted at an impossible angle, and her uniform was saturated with the black, oily fluid. But the worst part was her face. The features were stretched and blurred, and her mouth had been replaced entirely by the perfectly round, dark cavity Mac had seen inside the iron cage. The thing raised a hand, and its long, slender fingers pointed not at Mac, but past him, back up the maintenance tunnel. Then, from the darkness of the tunnels behind Mac, the same wet, echoing voice whispered the horrifying truth: "You should never have taken the counter, Detective." Mac realized the creature was not only in the vault, but it was behind him. He was trapped between the 2 manifestations of the void. Mac spun around, dropping into a firing stance, his pistol leveled at the blackness of the maintenance tunnel. The second voice, the one that had whispered the warning, was a palpable, chilling presence, but he saw nothing, only dust motes dancing in his flashlight beam. "Show yourself," Mac barked, his voice echoing flatly in the confined space. A low, resonant chuckle came from the dark. It wasn't human laughter. It sounded like wet gravel tumbling down a metal chute. "I am always shown, Detective," the voice whispered. "I am the space you didn't notice. The dimension that fits between your walls. You brought the key to my door." Mac knew he couldn't waste time on an invisible enemy when the physical horror of Reid was in the vault. He backed toward the steel door, never taking his eyes off the tunnel mouth. He glanced back through the observation window at the thing wearing Reid's uniform. It was now pressing its face, or where its face should be, against the glass. The dark, circular void where the mouth should be seemed to inhale the light from his flashlight. The darkness intensifying, Mac aimed his pistol at the 3 heavy-duty locks. If he could blast them open, he could get to the encased machinery, the anchor point beneath the precinct. Maybe there was a shut-off switch, or a way to physically destabilize the anchor. He took aim at the top lock, but before he could fire, the voice from the tunnel hissed, "Don't break the geometry." Then, the concrete floor beneath Mac cracked with the force of a small explosion. A shadow peeled itself from the ground, solidifying into a twisted, geometric shape, a non-Euclidean sculpture of dark, glistening fluid and bone-white sinew. It was similar to the mass inside the iron cage, but smaller, faster, and mobile. Mac fired 3 times into the apparition. The bullets hit the solid, dark mass with a dull thud and passed through it, splashing black, oily liquid onto the concrete wall behind it. The creature didn't recoil, it simply folded in on itself and then reformed, closer to Mac. This was not a ghost or a monster. It was something that defied physical laws, existing on multiple planes at once. Mac holstered his useless pistol and pulled out the 2 wooden figurines, the resonance counters. He knew the machine at the Pendleton Estate was anchored by these. Perhaps they could also repel this hostile extension of the mechanism. He thrust the 2 pulsating counters toward the creature. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The moment the carved wood crossed the creature's path, the geometric mass shrieked, a sound of pure electronic feedback and grinding metal. The creature dissolved again, but this time, it didn't reform. It vanished into the shadow of the wall, the only sign of its presence being a small, sizzling pool of black fluid. The counters were burning hot in his hand. He looked back at the vault window. The Officer Reid thing was gone. The vault was empty. But then Mac saw something new. On the steel floor of the vault chamber, a patch of the concrete encasing the machinery was slowly liquefying, dripping off the metal structure like wax. The entire structure was being slowly eaten away by the void. Mac glanced at the map in his pocket. He had to stop the dissolution before the anchor was completely destroyed, which would likely cause a catastrophic, multi-dimensional collapse. He smashed his crowbar into the middle lock on the steel door. Sparks flew, and the lock sprung open. He repeated the action on the remaining 2. He kicked the steel door open and rushed inside. The encased machinery, the exposed anchor point, was leaking the black fluid. Mac saw what he needed. Embedded in the metal casing of the anchor, where the concrete hadn't dissolved yet, was a small, brass plate with a series of numbered buttons and a faded label, System Containment Switch, Pendleton. He reached for the plate, but as his fingers brushed the cold brass, the vault door slammed shut behind him with an earth-shattering boom. The lights in the vault chamber, powered by a single, emergency bulb, flickered off. In the absolute darkness, the metallic, twisted shape of the encased anchor point began to emit a soft, pulsating, red light. The light was not illuminating the room, it was shining from inside the metal. And then, Mac felt a delicate, cold pressure on the back of his neck. A whisper, dry and papery, directly against his ear canal. "It is rude to leave a conversation unfinished, detective." The breath on Mac's neck was icy, smelling of rust and ozone. His instincts, honed by years of close calls, screamed immobilize and escape. He dropped the 2 burning wooden counters and rolled violently to his left, drawing his service knife, a backup plan against the impossible. His move dislodged the unseen presence. He heard a swift, wet slithering sound as something retreated into the gloom near the vault door. Mac snatched the counters back up and pointed his flashlight at the system containment switch on the central, concrete-encased anchor. He had no time for caution. He slammed his fist onto the brass plate. The buttons were stiff and unresponsive. The label was a lie. It wasn't a switch, but a keypad. He had to enter a sequence. The red light pulsing from the encased mechanism intensified, bathing the room in a bloody glow. The air was now filled with a deafening, high-pitched static, not audio noise, but a raw, physical vibration that made his teeth ache. Mac frantically flipped through Pendleton's journal, ignoring the pain. He needed a number, a code, anything that Dr. Pendleton would consider a stabilization sequence. He found a page near the end, filled with complex mathematical symbols and astronomical coordinates. At the bottom, circled multiple times in manic red ink, was a date, 9-1-99. The date of the final, terrifying entry about the entity growing hungry. Mac tried the code, 9199. He punched the numbers into the keypad. Nothing happened. The static surged. From the darkness near the ceiling, the wet, whispering voice returned, closer now, dripping with malicious amusement. The doctor favored geometry, not dates, detective. Look closer at his little carvings. Mac looked down at the two wooden counters in his hand. Their twisted, abstract forms weren't random. They were complex, non-symmetrical shapes carved with deep, precise lines. That he remembered the drawing of the 5 anchor points, and the 4 connecting lines, the missing piece of the geometrical defense. The carvings represented the missing stability. Mac flipped back to the map. He looked at the 5 locations: estate, iron works, reservoir, library, and P8. He had 2 counters. He needed 3 more to complete the sequence. The voice was right. The shape was the key. Mac thought back to the items he saw on the dusty table in the Pendleton attic, a line of 5 figurines. That implied 5 key inputs, a pentagram of control. He looked at the keypad again. It had 5 recessed key slots. Then, a new sound cut through the static, a loud, rhythmic squelching, accompanied by the wet thump of something heavy being dragged. It was coming from the maintenance tunnels, moving toward the vault door. The Reid thing was returning, and it was bringing friends. Mac had a sudden flash of insight, born from the terror and the journal's description of twisted form. The carvings represented the coordinates of the anchors themselves. He placed one of the wooden counters into the first key slot. The counter fit perfectly. A mechanical chime sounded, and the pulsing red light from the encased anchor dimmed slightly. He placed the second counter into the second key slot. Another chime, and the light dimmed further. 2 pieces down. 3 to go. The key was to find the remaining 3 counter figurines and place them in the correct geometrical order. The steel door leading back to the maintenance tunnels began to violently rattle. Something enormous was pressing against it. Mac knew the location of the next 3 counters had to correspond to the remaining 3 anchor points on the map: the iron works, the reservoir, and the library. He spoke into his radio, his voice strained by the static. "Sarge. I'm trapped in the sublevel vault. I need to get to 3 locations, fast. The old iron works, the city reservoir, and the central library sublevel. I need teams there now to secure specific items. They are small, carved wooden figures, resonance counters." The static on the radio was almost overwhelming. Mac's desperate transmission was met with a burst of electronic. Screaming, the rattling of the vault door stopped. The air went still, and then, a tiny, almost subliminal sound reached Mac's ears from the maintenance tunnel. A dry, scraping sound, like claws on concrete. Claw, scrape, crawl. It wasn't the Reid thing. It was something smaller, faster, and multiple. Mac realized the creature he had repelled with the counters hadn't fled. It had split. He looked at the keypad. He had to trust that his radio call got through. He had to get out of this vault and guide the search for the missing pieces, even as the walls around him began to audibly weep black, viscous fluid. He slammed his shoulder against the vault door. It barely moved. He was locked in, with the whispering entity and its multiplying, hostile geometry closing in. Mac slammed the steel vault door repeatedly, adrenaline surging through his body, but the hinges were immovable. He was trapped in the pulsing red light of the anchor room, listening to the multiplied scraping sounds outside. He grabbed the radio again, shouting over the escalating static, "Davis! Respond! The precinct is compromised. The source is under us. I need those locations secured. Carvings. Wooden figures." A ragged, distorted voice finally cut through the white noise. It was Sergeant Davis, sounding breathless and terrified. "Mac. I hear you. We're pinned down upstairs." The lights went out, and something, Jesus, Mac, something moved in the walls. "But I sent 3 teams. Lieutenant Chen to the library, Officer Morales to the reservoir, and 2 guys, Barnes and Flynn, to the iron works. What do they do when they find the carvings? They are keys. They stop the dimensional breach. Tell them they must insert the carving into the first, obvious opening they find near the center of the building. Do not bring them back here. Mac commanded. The scraping outside the door intensified, accompanied by a hideous, chewing sound. Mac knew the risk. Inserting the counter stabilized the breach at that specific location, but it also activated that anchor point, potentially drawing the entity's attention there. It was a race to complete the geometric sequence before the entire network tore open. Location 1, the old iron works. Barnes and Flynn, two young officers, pulled up to the abandoned iron works, a sprawling industrial ruin famous for its intricate, rusted pipe systems. The air here was heavy with the smell of old oil and damp metal. They found the central control room, a massive circular space beneath a cooling tower. In the center of the floor, a perfectly circular hole had been drilled into the concrete, about the size of a manhole. Flynn knelt down. "I think this is the obvious opening, Barnes. Looks like a clean cut." Resting near the edge of the hole was another one of the wooden figurines. It was twisted, dark, and vibrating faintly. Barnes picked it up, his hand shaking. The moment he held it, the entire cooling tower above them began to emit a deep, resonant whine, the sound of metal being stretched past its breaking point. Flynn aimed his light into the hole. "It's not a pipe, Barnes. It's a deep shaft. And there's something down there." As he spoke, a high-velocity stream of the black, oily fluid erupted from the shaft, spraying the surrounding walls. And etched into the fluid-covered concrete, just below where the figurine had rested, was a small, brass plate with a perfect slot for the carving. Barnes shoved the wooden counter into the slot. The whine of the tower ceased instantly. The black fluid evaporated, leaving the air tasting clean and metallic. The anchor point was secured, but from the dark tunnels of the iron works, they heard a chorus of new sounds, a rapid clicking and chittering, multiplying and echoing. Something had noticed the closure. Location 2, the city reservoir. Lieutenant Quinn arrived at the reservoir, a vast, open-air tank of municipal water. The night was cold and the silence, compared to the precinct, was unnerving. She found the access house, a small, concrete structure at the edge of the tank. Inside, the space was dominated by a large, circular pressure gauge. The needle was violently spiking back and forth, far beyond safe limits. Near the base of the gauge, glued to the concrete, was the fourth resonance counter. Quinn pried the carving off the floor. As she did, the pressure gauge exploded in a shower of glass and steam. The water in the massive reservoir tank began to churn violently, forming a whirlpool directly over the center of the structure. A section of the concrete floor beneath the gauge melted away, revealing a dark pipe that descended into the churning water. On the exposed pipe, another slot was visible. Quinn, without hesitation, slammed the carving into the slot. The churning of the reservoir stopped immediately. The water went dead still, unnaturally clear and silent. A moment later, a plume of white fog, smelling faintly of ozone and metal, erupted from the pipe and rapidly filled the small access house, cutting Quinn off from her team. Location 3, the central library sublevel. Mac was shouting encouragement into the static-filled radio when Morales' strained voice cut through. "I'm at the library sublevel. The old rare book archive. It stinks of burnt paper and something else. I found the spot. It's an old electrical panel. The old library panel was charred from the 1988 fire." Morales pulled the panel cover off, revealing a tangle of burnt copper and ancient wiring. In the middle of the mess was a small, recessed box, and inside the box, the fifth and final wooden counter. As Morales reached for it, the power to the sublevel returned with a blinding flash. The light bulbs weren't white, they were a sickly, throbbing violet. The shadows in the rare book archive detached from the walls, elongating and twisting. They weren't just shadows, they were the same hostile, geometric shapes Mac had seen in the tunnel. Morales grabbed the carving and slammed it into the final, waiting slot in the electrical box. The violet light died instantly. The geometric shadows dissolved. A profound, echoing silence fell over the sublevel, a stillness that suggested the danger was not gone, but merely contained. Back in the precinct vault, Mac felt the violent shaking of the building instantly stop. The high-pitched static died. The red light from the encased mechanism winked out, replaced by a dull, pulsing blue. The steel vault door, which had been rattling moments before, fell silent. Mac looked at the keypad. The two counters he had inserted, the ones representing the estate and the precinct, were glowing steadily blue. The three external slots were also glowing blue. The pentagram was complete. The geometry was sealed. Mac heard a soft, sickening sigh outside the vault door. Then, the wet, whispering voice, now weaker, full of cold rage, spoke one last time. "You have stabilized the rift, Detective. But the key to the sequence is still here. And I will not allow you to complete the final geometry." The vault door suddenly unlocked, the heavy bolts retracting with a slow, grinding click. The presence had opened the door, inviting Mac out. Mac knew it was a trap, but he had to complete the sequence. The third piece, the key to the sequence, was likely the object that had been using the drawer and talking to him in the archive. He pushed the door open to find the maintenance tunnel dark and silent. But right outside the vault, standing perfectly still, was the mangled figure of Officer Reid. The creature's circular, void-like mouth was gone. It was replaced by a normal, human mouth, stretched into a wide, impossibly slow smile, and in her hand, she held the sixth and final wooden carving. Mac stared at the figure of Reid. The stretched smile was the most unsettling horror he had witnessed all night. It was an expression of pure, intelligent malice wearing a human face. In her hand, the sixth wooden carving pulsed with a deeper, more profound black light that seemed to absorb the ambient darkness. "Jenna," Mac said, his voice level despite the tremor in his hands. "Let me take the carving. It's over. We stabilized the rift." The reed thing tilted its head, the joints in its neck making a soft, dry pop sound. The voice that emerged from the unnaturally wide smile was hers, yet hollow, echoing off the metal walls. "Stabilized? Oh, Detective. You have not closed the door. You have merely put the frame back in place." Dr. Pendleton never wanted to close the hole. He wanted to listen to it. It raised the sixth carving. "This is not a counter. It is the observer. It is the key to the sequence because it is the heart of the pentagram, the point where the 5 anchors draw their power." Mac realized his mistake. The 5 counters created the geometric defense, but the sixth was the central trigger, needed either to power the entire network or to finally dismantle it. Pendleton's research. "He vanished when he activated this," Mac stated, moving slowly, calculating his angle of attack. "He ascended," the reed thing corrected, its smile widening. "He became part of the geometry. He is what gave me the strength to follow you. He is inside the silence." The creature lunged with impossible speed. It wasn't a run, it was a sickening, fluid slide across the concrete floor. Mac ducked beneath its elongated arm, the polished wood of the sixth carving narrowly missing his head. He didn't fire. He knew the bullets were useless against this manifestation. Instead, he dropped one of the blue glowing counters from his pocket, the precinct anchor, onto the floor. As he had hoped, the reed thing hesitated. The glowing blue counter was an object of stability, an irritant. Its focus shifted instantly from Mac to the piece of wood. "Give me that," the entity shrieked, its voice momentarily breaking back into Reid's natural tone, a sound of profound distress. Mac used the distraction to pivot and slam his crowbar into the steel floor, right at the foot of the entity. The blow was purely for noise and impact, but the vibration was enough. The creature stumbled, momentarily disjointed. In that instant, Mac kicked the sixth carving from its grasp. The black piece of wood skittered across the concrete toward the far wall of the tunnel. The reed thing let out a sound of pure electronic fury and dissolved into a pool of black fluid. The fluid didn't flow, however. It reformed immediately, but now there were 2 manifestations of Reid, both wet and fast, crawling toward the sixth carving. Mac scrambled, ignoring the creatures, and reached the far end of the maintenance tunnel, where a ladder led up to the main precinct floor. He radioed Davis one last time. "Sarge, listen. The precinct is the control center. There's a sixth carving in the sub-level tunnel. It's the final piece. You have to get to the main power grid and prepare to cut all power on my mark." He heard Davis's muffled, panicked voice. "Mac. The walls. They're bleeding the black stuff. The power grid is right next to the evidence room. Do it, Sarge. Get ready." Mac looked back. The 2 reed creatures were now at the wall, one grabbing the black carving while the other blocked the tunnel. Mac climbed the ladder, emerging into the main precinct bullpen. The sight was chaos, flickering lights, officers huddled behind desks, and thin rivulets of the black fluid dripping from the corners of the ceiling tiles. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and primal fear that he sprinted toward the evidence room. He had to get to the fifth key input, the one he had left open at the precinct anchor, before the entity could use the observer counter to activate the mechanism that he burst into the evidence room. In the center of the floor, the fifth key slot, the one where the precinct counter should have been, was glowing a deep, beckoning blue. The walls of the evidence room began to ripple. The concrete cracked, and the sound of the metallic, geometric chuckle filled the room. The steel door to the maintenance tunnel was ripped open with a sound like tearing canvas. Standing in the doorway was the creature, now whole again, but holding the sixth black carving like a ritualistic dagger. It took one step, and the black fluid coating its uniform evaporated instantly, leaving the cloth dry and clean. It was no longer just an animated corpse. It was the gatekeeper. It raised the sixth carving, aiming it at the precinct anchor point. The observation begins now, Detective. Mac threw himself forward, reaching for the open key slot, knowing he was seconds away from an irreversible breach. Mac slammed his remaining blue-glowing counter, the one he had temporarily dropped in the tunnel, into the fifth key slot in the evidence room floor. The click was loud and final. The moment the carving was seated, the precinct anchor point flashed with brilliant, blinding blue light, stabilizing the geometry once more. The black fluid dripping from the ceiling instantly receded, evaporating into a fine, metallic dust. The humming static died down, the network was secured, the pentagram of stability complete. However, the Reid thing, the gatekeeper, was already in motion. It lunged, not at Mac, but at the activated key slot. It plunged the sixth, black glowing observer carving into the center of the pentagram, a small, unmarked aperture Mac hadn't noticed before, located directly next to the fifth blue slot. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The blue stabilization lights in all 5 slots of the pentagram flickered violently, then turned a searing, chaotic white. The anchor beneath the floor didn't stabilize. It began to resonate. The sound was not an explosion, but a rapid, rhythmic, impossibly complex vibration, a feedback loop where the 5 anchors, meant to hold the void still, were now amplifying its energy back into the central observer. The gatekeeper let out a triumphant, echoing shriek that shook the building. The wide, smiling mouth opened wider, revealing no teeth, but only the churning, wet darkness of the void. The system is now powered, Detective. The geometry observes, the entity screamed. Through the large evidence room window, Mac could see Sergeant Davis and 2 officers desperately fighting to clear the power panel near the exit. Davis was screaming, "Mac! Do it! Now!" Mac grabbed his radio. "Davis! Cut the power! Cut all power to Precinct 8! The gatekeeper focused its attention fully on Mac. The air around the creature grew hazy, shimmering with heat. It raised its arms, and the shadows in the room, the ones the stabilization had driven away, coalesced and lunged, forming dark, geometric chains that wrapped around Mac's arms and legs, pinning him to the floor. "You cannot stop observation," the creature hissed, slowly walking toward the now immobile Mac. Pendleton's final success was not control, but acceptance. The void is here. It is looking out through the hole. The creature leaned down, its face inches from Mac's. The smell of ozone and wet iron was overwhelming. The churning darkness in its mouth seemed to draw the light from Mac's eyes. "And it wants to see what you are." Just as the gatekeeper moved its hand toward Mac's face, reaching for his eyes, the lights in the entire precinct, the emergency bulbs, the desk lamps, the violent white glow from the anchor, died. The entire building went into a state of absolute, profound darkness and silence. The sudden, total absence of electrical energy broke the dimensional feedback loop. The geometric shadows holding Mac dissolved into harmless, natural darkness. The high-pitched resonance stopped instantly. Mac, gasping for breath, scrambled away from where the entity had been standing. The profound quiet was almost painful. The black light from the observer counter was gone. He heard a faint, wet slump sound. He fumbled for his small tactical flashlight. When the beam cut through the thick darkness, it illuminated a small, unsettling scene in the center of the evidence room. The 5 blue counters were dark and inert in their slots. The observer counter was lying on the concrete floor, cracked down the middle, its black light extinguished, and lying next to the two broken pieces of wood was the body of Officer Reid. The body was unnaturally pale, covered in drying metallic fluid, but the terrible void mouth was gone. Her face was normal, placid, and utterly devoid of life. Mac knelt beside her, checking for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there. The gatekeeper was gone, driven out by the total power failure, leaving its host behind. He looked up. The emergency exit door was kicked open, and Sergeant Davis was standing there, his face illuminated by the shaky beam of a police flashlight. Mac. What happened? The power is out for the whole block. What was that noise? Mac looked down at Jenna Reid's lifeless body, then at the cracked, useless observer carving. We bought ourselves some time, Sarge, Mac said, his voice flat with exhaustion and horror. We shut down the local network. But we didn't close the hole. The entity is still out there. And Pendleton's journal is still talking. Mac reached into his pocket and pulled out the old leather book. He flipped to the very last page, where the frantic scribbles ended. The page was no longer filled with ink. The script had been overwritten with a new message, etched deeply into the paper fibers, as if burned by an internal fire. It was in English, clear and chillingly coherent. The observation has been thwarted. But I saw the other pieces. I saw the map. The geometry is already known to me. Now, I will find them myself. I will find the others. And I will find a larger door. The last line was a single, terrifying word, the city. The massive citywide blackout lasted only 37 minutes, but in that span, Precinct 8 was transformed into a grave site and a makeshift command center. Emergency power generators sputtered to life, casting harsh, yellow light over the chaos. Mac sat in a cramped office, now designated the official, incident room, staring at the city map pinned to the wall. The 5 anchor points, the estate, the iron works, the reservoir, the library, and the precinct, were circled in aggressive red ink. Sergeant Davis stood guard at the door. The state police are here, Mac. They're running point on the blackout investigation, but we're holding them off the internal stuff. They think it was a transformer failure. Should we tell them about the geometry? Mac shook his head, running a weary hand over his face. No. Tell them we had a major power surge during a forced entry. They'd lock us up for saying dimensional geometry. And they'd risk activating the anchor again. He looked down at the last page of Pendleton's journal. The message burned into the paper was still there. I will find a larger door. The city. The entity didn't just want to use the house or the precinct, Sarge, Mac explained, tracing a line from the map center out to the city limits. Pendleton's mechanism was a tiny pinprick. The entity saw the whole network, the whole city, through the observer counter before we shut it down. It saw a way to tear a hole wide enough for it to truly exist here. So, what's the next move? Davis asked, his voice low. We follow Pendleton's original plan, the one he failed to execute. The geometry has to be permanently neutralized. Mac pointed to the 5 circled locations. The carving stabilized the anchors, but the mechanisms are still buried. We have to retrieve the 5 counters, and then we have to destroy all 5 anchor mechanisms simultaneously. The moment we remove those carvings, the breach starts again. Epilogue. The silence of the geometry. It took 3 days to execute the plan, operating entirely off the books, covering their movements under the guise of the blackout investigation. AC led 5 teams, each armed with high-grade shaped charges and the necessary knowledge to breach the foundations of the estate, the iron works, the reservoir, the library, and Precinct 8. At 3 a.m., the exact time the initial call came in, Mac stood in the hidden vault beneath Precinct 8. He placed the final 5 counters back into the key slots of the encased anchor mechanism. They glowed a pale, comforting blue, silencing the structure beneath the concrete. All teams reporting stability. Davis's voice crackled over the secure channel. We're holding position, Mac. Ready for detonation. Initiate sequence, Mac whispered, looking at the silent mechanism. 1, 2, 3. Detonate. 5 muffled, simultaneous explosions rocked the city. Mac felt the tremor beneath his feet, a heavy, final shudder. The shockwave wasn't just physical, it was a profound, spatial silence. The blue light from the 5 carvings in the vault winked out, and the air went cold and utterly, finally still. The metallic, coppery smell was gone, the 5 anchor mechanisms, the machine at the estate, the foundation under the precinct, the sublevels of the library, the reservoir, and the iron works, were reduced to dust and rubble, completely severed from their intended purpose. Mac climbed out of the sublevel and walked into the morning sun. The horror was over. 1 week later, Mac was back in Precinct 8, filling out the mountains of paperwork necessary to explain the missing officer. Jenna Reid was officially listed as killed during a structural collapse, and the localized damages that he was tired, but the icy calm had returned. He had closed the file on the Pendleton geometry. He reached into his desk drawer for a pen and felt a familiar, sharp edge. He pulled out the final piece of wood, one of the cracked halves of the observer carving. He had kept it as a morbid reminder. As his fingers closed around the smooth, dark wood, he felt a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. Mac quickly flipped the carving over. The 2 pieces of wood were fusing together, the crack slowly sealing itself. The wood was not inert, it was healing. Mac stared at the carving. He hadn't destroyed the entity. He had merely destroyed its door. The entity, the intelligence, the observer, was still here, contained within the broken but regenerating wood. And then, Mac heard a new sound, one he had never heard before in the precinct. It was a soft, wet, rhythmic tapping, coming from the ventilation shaft